I think we thought it would be a special occasion, but we did not fully realize, or else we would have found a much larger room. And so one sign that it's a special occasion is this extraordinary audience. Another sign is that you have not one but two introductions. Of the people who are speaking this evening, I am by far the least important. My purpose here is to express some thanks. Thanks, of course, to Dr. Davis, who will be thanked many times, but thanks especially to the student organization that I advise. That is the organization that once was known as the History Association. Dr. Davis served as its advisor for at least 15 years, I believe, somewhere in that area. I subsequently took it over with a group of extraordinarily intelligent and enterprising students who recognized the value of changing the name from the History Association to the History of Tomorrow, which perhaps not coincidentally has the acronym HOT. Which brings us to in meetings discussing what our activities for the year would be, some of the students said we should really present a convo. And as people talked about presenting a convo, some of the students said Dr. Davis. Among those students is the president of the History Association, Matthew Schneider, and it is to Matt that we owe this invitation to Dr. Davis, the organizational work that has brought him before us, and I would like to express extremely warm thanks to all members of the organization for their work in bringing us together. This truly is a student-initiated and student-led event. Dr. Davis, throughout his career, was extraordinarily devoted to the students, and they knew it every moment in his classroom, so therefore it's exceptionally appropriate that this be a student event.
Welcome, everybody. I am the second introduction. Weird how that works, but just wanted to come in here and highlight some of what Professor Davis has done and to celebrate his accomplishments. Dr. Davis has contributed much to the world of academia and to Jacksonville and to the Illinois College community. Many of you are familiar with his work, as well you should be, as he has been actively involved in the IC community since 1971. And in the years since, Professor Davis has accomplished a lifetime of accomplishment and has gained recognition in a multitude of ways and in varying degrees. Specializing in 19th century American history, Professor Davis has authored books such as Frontier Illinois and Dreams to Dust, which recounts the story of an American anthropologist caught up in the 1849 gold rush phenomenon. For Dreams to Dust, he earned national recognition, being nominated for several awards such as the Bancroft Prize and the Parkman Award. Additionally, he's received numerous grants from the National Endowment for Humanities, enabling him to lead 3 summer seminars for teachers from all across the country about life on the frontier. He's also received 2 grants enabling him to study art and architecture in Russia. On a more local level, it should be noted that his true passion was teaching students. It is absolutely shown throughout his career. In fact, he was the first professor to win the esteemed Dunbar Distinguished Teaching Award twice, in 1981 and again in 1993. It is, of course, no surprise to those of you who have had Professor Davis in class, and for those of you who know him personally. In class, students typically found themselves looking at him and each other in awe as he lectured from memory and answered any question with absolute certainty. I know you will. It is important to note, though, that his involvement with students did not end in the classroom. As Professor Davis has already Professor Kunith has already mentioned, he served many years as the advisor to the History Association, or today's organization, History of Tomorrow. Over the decades, he has accompanied students on researching trips to the Library of Congress and to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. He's taken students abroad to countries such as the Soviet Union, and he's taken students to French country in southern Illinois, as well as to Civil War battlefields. It has been 41 years since Professor Davis first set foot on the hilltop, and 49 since he first started his teaching career at a junior high school in Dearborn, Michigan. It is evident that Professor Davis has achieved much and made tremendous strides in the field of history. And while the campus community will miss him, he will be returning to his roots and to his family in southeastern Michigan as a successful and accomplished historian. Please join me in welcoming, one last time on the Illinois College campus, Professor Emeritus of History, James Davis.
Thank you, Matt. I'm overwhelmed. My single page of feeble thank yous is really insufficient to say thank you to all of you who came out today. So many former students are here, wonderful people some of whom go back to 1971. I greeted Chuck Murphy in the back, and Betsy and Carol and Pam and Mike and so many other wonderful students are here from the past, far too numerous to mention all, and I'm sorry I can't mention them all, but I appreciate that immensely. And I appreciate all of you, your being here, colleagues and friends and associates in various ways. I'm deeply touched by your being here and honored. Some of you, such as Mark Johnston over here, Johnson from the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, have driven from Springfield, as has Chuck Murphy and have some others as well. So again, my deep and sincere thank you for being here, good colleagues and friends and associates. Matt, thank you so much for that very, very fine introduction, very moving. He's the president of the History of Tomorrow, and he's a very, very fine student. And I thank him and the organization for inviting me to speak here this evening. I would also like to thank him for organizing this event and running off the numerous handouts that we'll have partway into the presentation. Not nearly enough for you, I'm afraid. One of the handouts is this. And I want to recognize the Cass County Star-Gazette for making 40 of these copies available. This is their special edition. This is for the students. So when this is passed out, students, this is for you. There aren't enough to go around, but I hope you can share them. I also want to thank today Professor Michael Westbrook and Mrs. Doyle in the Shiwi Library and Mr. Chris Ashmore at the Public Library for finding materials for me and for helping me in different ways. I also want to call your attention to several books on the Civil War that I have up here. This is by Professor Proffitt. This is a novel on the Civil War, and it can be read with great profit for understanding the war. This is Manchester Bluff, and it is on sale here on campus and down at the bookstore as well, downtown. And this work by Don Doyle is a wonderful work for understanding Jacksonville in the age of the Civil War. It is still in print, I hope, and it's been in print for a long time, and it's a grand work. I also want to thank my dear friend Ivor Yeager, who is here tonight with his wife Natalie, and I want to thank them for being here and for 41 years of support for me. They've been out in so many cases to hear my talks, and they've supported me in countless ways over 4 decades. So a very special thanks for them. Ivor is the wonderful, Ivor produced this wonderful, superb work on Illinois College. If you've not read this, you really should. It gets to the heart of what the college was and is, and it's a wonderful work, and I recommend it highly. These 3 works have been real blessings to the community here. I also want to thank my wife, who also has been my mainstay and support, my best friend for over 45 years, and she's been out to many of these talks in the past, and I thank her for being here this evening as well. For the next 45 minutes or so, and it may seem like an eternity for some of you who are standing, but I hope to share some of my understandings of the Civil War with you and the relationships to the college and the town, and then I'll try to take any questions that you might have. This evening's talk stems from talks I've given elsewhere over a number of years and from research that I've been doing on the Civil War since 1984 in libraries on the East Coast and here in the Midwest. My research focuses on the lower north, that is to say the area from Missouri across here, across southern Indiana, southern Ohio, right on to New Jersey. That is the lower north, and that's a place I'm very interested in terms of the Civil War. The Civil War was by far the biggest war in our nation's history, as you know. It was the war that nearly destroyed our country. Almost as many Americans died in that war as in all of our other wars put together. Our population in 1860 was 31 million, barely 1/10 of what it is today, and about 3 million men, north and south, served in that war. Some 620,000 soldiers died during the war, and perhaps 50,000 civilians died prematurely because of the hardships of the war. In pondering the war, one salient fact I think must be kept in mind. Every day of the war, approximately 425 soldiers died. Since our population in 1860 was barely 1/10 of what it is today, the loss of 425 soldiers each day from 1861 to 1865 today would be equal to the daily loss of about 4,250. As is true of most wars, the Civil War changed radically as it was being fought, becoming by 1865 something no one in 1861 could have foreseen. The war destroyed slavery, fundamentally changed race relations, weakened the states in the federal structure, added constitutional amendments, distorted the economy, and crippled the Democratic Party for decades. To be sure, Abraham Lincoln and others insisted well into 1862 that the war was being waged only to preserve the Union, not to destroy slavery, and certainly not to grant slaves citizenship or anything like equal rights. By mid-1862, however, the war had become a war to destroy slavery and thereby erode Southern war-making capabilities. Wars always warp and distort societies and economies, speeding up some things, slowing down other things, and creating indelible new realities. And this war did all of those things. Just as we can see the American Revolution as our first Civil War, so too we can see the Civil War as our second American Revolution. The war's complex and evolving nature is reflected by the fact that the war is called by approximately 25 different names. The variety of these names and their changing popularity over time reflects the changing thought about the war, its results, and its turbulent origins. From the earliest years of Illinois College, students here keenly followed turbulent issues. The small stone marker, about 60 feet northwest of Sturtevant, of the Sturtevant building, manifests their interest in slavery, abolition, and the resulting violence. This stone marker commemorates a meeting called by Illinois College students in November 1837 to protest the killing in Alton of Elijah P. Lovejoy, a leading abolitionist. I see students stayed interested in such volatile issues as the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, and the election of 1860. Perhaps most politically active students on campus were either Republicans or anti-Nebraska Democrats, that is, Democrats who opposed the further spread of slavery. At the same time, however, students who were anti-slavery were much like Abraham Lincoln in being both anti-slavery and anti-abolitionist. For whatever reason, they opposed slavery and its further spread, but they also opposed the strident agitation of abolitionists, fearing that such agitation might erode the social glue that holds societies together and lead to civil war. On the cusp of the Civil War, Illinois College appeared to be rock solid. In its advertisement in the Jacksonville City Directory for 1861, described the college in glowing terms: Christian without being sectarian, conservative without being bigoted, progressive without being radical, and aiming at no ephemeral popularity. It has been from the beginning a power in the state. It was never more prosperous than now. Its regular course of study is substantially that of Yale and Harvard. And then it added that tuition for the coming year would run a whopping $30. The college still required students to attend chapel every morning and on Sunday afternoon. They had to attend church on Sundays, but they could choose the church they attended. Classes still began in mid-September and ended in mid-June. No dorms existed, so students roomed and boarded around town. Students had access to the college library twice a week and were able to borrow books from the Literary Society libraries. The college had 3 departments: the college department, the scientific department, and the preparatory department. The war, however, brought significant changes to the college. The late 1850s saw serious challenges to the college, challenges that continued into the war. Enrollment in the college and the preparatory department plunged from 160 in 1858-59 to 132 in 1859-60 to 119 60-61, and then sank to just 74 in 62-63. Although IC did not close during the war, as many colleges did, times were tough. Harsh economic realities beginning in 1857 probably caused some students to leave, especially as political instability and then secession in 1860 produced economic turbulence and uncertainty. Other losses occurred after the war broke out in April of 1861, when IC students rushed to join the armed forces. But a third factor helped trigger a precipitous decline in enrollment before and during the war. Sharp arguments over slavery, abolitionism, and the proper role of government and related matters boiled over on the campus, producing anger and fear. Some students from Kentucky, Virginia, Missouri, and Louisiana felt put upon by other students and the faculty. Some responded by leaving the college before the war broke out, but others persisted. Truman O. Douglas, who graduated in 1865, recalled angry debates in the college halls in 1861, causing some pro-Southern students to leave. Before Jonathan Baldwin Turner resigned from the Illinois College faculty in the early 1850s, he pushed anti-slavery ideas onto students. After he left, his role was assumed by William D. Sanders, a strident anti-slavery faculty member who zealously stifled dissenting views concerning slavery. Phi Alpha meetings were especially contentious, and members often attacked the Republican Party and defended Southern views. This caused trouble with other students and with faculty members. 2 famous clashes between Professor Sanders and students occurred, one in 1857 and the other in 1862, and are told very well by President Charles Rammelkamp in his history of the college, and by Dean Ivor Yeager in his very fine book on Julian Sturtevant. Simply put, Sanders did not want students to present ideas on campus that were either pro-Southern or against abolition. The students involved wanted to place abolition on the defensive by suggesting that it was causing trouble. Newspapers, including the staunchly Democratic Oregon and St. Louis, the Missouri Republican, reported the controversies to embarrass the college. The main students involved, all Phis, were denied their diplomas, but years later they did receive their diplomas and were restored to their class. Many people living in the region had Southern roots. For various reasons, they were against slavery and the kind of society that slavery produced, but for various other reasons, they were also against abolitionists, and against what they thought was arrogant northern cultural imperialism. They were numerous, and in the election of 1860, neither Abraham Lincoln nor Richard Yates carried Morgan County nor Menard County. Yates did carry Sangamon County by 8 votes or something. After Abraham Lincoln's nomination for the presidency, conditions became highly combustible on campus. Fueling the flames in Jacksonville, the Young Men's Republican Club met every Saturday evening, and in the election of 1860, it bought and passed out 500 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin to stir up feeling against slavery. Throughout the nation in 1860, Republican clubs sprang up called Wide Awake clubs. These were quasi-military organizations that were militantly vigilant on behalf of Republicans and Abraham Lincoln. Wide Awake associations sprang up in Illinois, and the members wore marshal-like uniforms, marched down the street in massed ranks, and carried clubs for intimidation and street brawls. Some carried concealed weapons. Throughout the North, the Wide Awakes of 1860, like the Minutemen of 1775 in Massachusetts, stood ready to spring into action on a moment's notice. Men in Jacksonville had formed 3 voluntary military associations by midsummer 1860. The Union Guards, the Hardened Light Guards, and in July of 1860, the Jacksonville Artillery. Almost certainly, some IC students joined these organizations or similar ones. The country was arming itself, and IC was part of that mobilization. Conducted against the backdrop of national economic woe, open threats, and a feeling of ominous dread, the election of 1860 was fierce. Over 80% of the eligible voters going to the polls. The election was also unusual. 4 candidates vied for the presidency. Abraham Lincoln won handily in the Electoral College with 180 votes, despite receiving only 39.8% of the popular vote. But even if all of the popular votes for the other 3 candidates had gone to just one of the other candidates, Lincoln would still have won the election with 173 electoral votes, the strange workings of our wonderful Electoral College operating to create this effect. So if you ever hear criticism of the Electoral College, respond by saying Abraham Lincoln and the election of 1860. Students across the country joined other people in debating the virtues of the Electoral College, and almost certainly IC students and faculty had heated debates about this and other matters. Jacksonville in 1860 had about 5,500 residents, about double its 1850 population. Most houses and other structures in town were made of wood. Some brick buildings graced the square, including the county courthouse on the square. The 3 state institutions, the colleges, and the new Congregational Church on West State Street, and a handful of private homes were also brick. The town was a walking town, which meant that nearly everyone went about their daily business on foot, not on horses or in wagons or carriages. The first public conveyances, horse-drawn streetcars, did not operate until the early 1870s. The town did enjoy the high-tech wonder of the day, the telegraph, by 1848, and permanent railroad service several years later. In 1858, a new gas works supplied natural gas for lighting in stores and in residences. On April 12, 1861, news of the Confederate firing at Fort Sumter flashed to Jacksonville via telegraph. Soon, a large bipartisan meeting in the new Strong Opera House pledged support for the war effort. Fifes and drums were heard in the town for days afterwards, and 2 more military companies were formed. Evidently, no voices were raised in town in support of the South at that time. Charles Rammelkamp wrote Charles Rammelkamp recounted the campus reaction. The firing on Fort Sumter produced excitement on the Illinois College campus, as it did everywhere else in the North. The question was now no longer an academic one. The day of compromise was over, and when President Lincoln issued the first appeal for volunteers in the spring of 1861, 26 Illinois College students at once answered the call. Moreover, IC was the alma mater of Illinois Civil War Governor Richard Yates, a member of the first graduating class of 1835. Yates worked closely with President Lincoln to keep Illinois in the war and to ensure Illinois' support throughout the war. Friction among students before and after the war and between the faculty continued after the war began. Opposition to the war surfaced openly and flourished covertly. In late 1861, in an effort to lampoon the local home guard, some pro-Southern IC students marched around the square with sticks over their shoulders, with their clothing, for some reason, turned inside out, and with a banner and a horn, and they were trying to embarrass the local home guard. After Professor Sanders censored student presentations in 1862, Democrats and pro-Southern folk gave the students a public forum by renting the Strand Opera House for a meeting, one that triggered rapturous applause, according to the newspaper, from the audience. Campus tensions continued to the end of the war. During the war, IC students and faculty helped town folks suppress local Copperhead elements. Copperhead elements had formed the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret political society that formed militant castles throughout the lower north. These castles intimidated military recruiters, firebombed Republican newspaper offices, distributed anti-war literature, and armed themselves. In September 1863, at least 200, one source says 400, armed Knights of the Golden Circle rode into Jacksonville to ensure a fair trial for one of their members who was on trial for assault. They, the group of 200, informed residents that another 1,000 armed knights were on horseback out along the Movestar Creek and would attack if the trial were not fair. The incident passed without violence, but IC students participated in the Union League, a statewide organization formed to suppress Copperheads and defend Illinois. The Union League had systems of secret communications, passwords, and stores of weapons. As was true in virtually every state, so many young men rushed to join the military in Illinois and elsewhere that governors had to turn scores of thousands away. There simply were not enough camps, uniforms, equipment to outfit all who rushed to join. Motives for joining the Army varied, but for many young men, feelings of patriotism and the desire to save the Union and avenge the attack on Fort Sumter mingled with a desire to join a vast undertaking, one that would take men far from home, many for the first time in their lives. Most believed the war would be short, probably no more than a few months. Casualties among their units would be few, the dead would die nobly, and the vast majority of them would return home as heroes. As is true of all of our wars, we were almost totally unprepared for this war. Our national population again was 31 million, but our regular Army numbered 16,000. Nearly all of the Army, furthermore, was stationed along the Canadian border or at isolated outposts out on the Great Plains or on the West Coast. In addition, our militia system was in a woeful state of neglect and disrepair. On May 4th, 1861, the War Department issued General Orders number 15, calling for the states to create an army of volunteers between 25,000 and 42,000 in number, comprising 39 infantry regiments and 1 cavalry regiment. Virtually no one even contemplated at this time a national draft. General Orders number 15 spelled out how states were to form volunteer regiments, how many were to be formed, how the regiments were to be combined into brigades, how the brigades were to be formed into divisions, and other matters. including pay and the promotion from ranks. Some states, including Illinois, ignored parts of these orders and did things their own way. Responding to General Orders number 15 by passing the so-called 10-regiment bill, which created 10 regiments of volunteers, 1 regiment per congressional district in Illinois. Each regiment was to have 10 companies and up to just over 1,000 men and officers, colonels commanding the regiments and captains commanding the companies. Out of deference to the 6 regiments of volunteers raised by Illinois for the Mexican War, the numbering of regiments in Illinois began with the number 7. Before the war was over, Illinois would raise 150 regiments of infantry, 17 regiments of cavalry, 2 regiments of artillery, and a number of independent artillery batteries and other units. Nearly 260,000 Illinoisans served in the war. Some 2,732 hailed from Morgan County, which then had a population of only about 22,000. Volunteers in Illinois enlisted in such numbers by the end of the war that only 3,538 had to be drafted. Some communities, including Jacksonville, proudly noted that the draft never had to operate there. The men kept volunteering to the end of the war. The raising of regiments reflected deeply grained ideas about democracy, avoiding some stipulations in General Orders number 15. Men raising companies in Illinois influenced who could lead the companies. In some locales, men elected their captains, with prominent men campaigning to win election. Sometimes those who failed to be elected captains became lieutenants in the companies. In other communities, selections were made by informal consensus. Some captains were appointed after the regiments were formed. Few captains had any military service other than possibly serving in the militia, an institution that was in general disrepair. Elected captains then either elected colonels or had a say in the selection of colonels, sometimes offering the names of prospects to the state governor, who then made the selection. The process varied from place to place and time to time, but it did reflect democratic sentiment. Remarkably, many of the colonels and captains performed well. A few, however, had the good sense to realize that they were simply not cut out to command, and they resigned their commissions before their regiments left camp. In other instances, they resigned as they neared the seat of war in the South or after the first battle. IC students were certainly familiar with death. Some mortality tables that will be passed out later on highlight deaths at early ages, mostly from childhood diseases. Accidents, childbirth, and other causes claim many adults. Almost certainly IC students from towns had attended services as school kids for fellow students who died during the summers. Moreover, many students from farms had witnessed early winter hog slaughters and other wholesale deaths of other farm animals. As young men rushed to war in 1861, they were no strangers to death. In Morgan County, the 14th Regiment was formed in 1861 according to the state legislature's 10-regiment bill. Companies formed in Cass, Christian, Greene, Jersey, Macoupin, Menard, Morgan, Sangamon, Scott counties forming the 6th Congressional District. The companies met in Jacksonville in May, where they were mustered into state service on May 11th, and then on May 25th into United States service for 3 years. They trained at Camp Duncan, located out on the fairgrounds, and then they left for Missouri to suppress pro-Confederate sentiment there. Camp Duncan also hosted Colonel Ulysses S. Grant and his 21st Regiment when it marched from Springfield on the Old State Road over to Jacksonville in July of 1861. An intriguing newspaper reference in August of 1861 mentions a Camp Hunter in Jacksonville located just southwest of the campus, but it was apparently short-lived. Before leaving for service, regiments typically receive their regimental flag and their national flag, which were often made by local leading women and presented to the regiments in a formal ceremony. Many departing regiments received dinners, political speeches, music, and prayers. Sometimes soldiers received training for a few weeks in local camps, which were called camps of instruction. Perhaps 40 camps of instruction sprang up in Illinois, the two biggest ones being Camp Butler over in Springfield and Camp Douglas up in Chicago. Most were ramshackle affairs, but in them soldiers did receive their uniforms, formed messes for meals, underwent long hours of close order drill, learned how to take orders, and sometimes there received their weapons and other equipment. The first regimental deaths usually occurred in these camps, usually from diseases or by accident, often from the misuse of their new weapons. Many rural men had not experienced childhood diseases before going to camps of instruction, where they often caught these diseases from townspeople and died. Crime, usually petty crime and desertion, plagued some camps. Although most men in both armies were from rural areas and had access to rifles, men were not good marksmen, especially in the first 3 years of the war. One reason for this was the great cost of ammunition. Also, some soldiers marched to their first battle without ever having fired their weapons, even once. As the war went on, that did change. Inexperienced soldiers tended to shoot high, and veteran regiments breathed a collective sigh of relief when enemy bullets whizzed overhead and showered them with leaves and twigs from trees overhead. Other soldiers early in the war, not wanting to kill anyone, wrote about deliberately firing too high to hit the enemy. Others simply did not fire, sometimes going through the motions of loading and firing. General Ambrose Burnside, a former gunsmith from Rhode Island, lamented the recruits under his command. He said, "Out of 10 soldiers who are perfect in drill and manual of arms, only one knows the purpose of the sight on the end of the gun." Or can hit the broadside of a barn. Inaccurate firing was evident as late as the Battle of Gettysburg, where it took the firing of somewhere between 14 and 16 million rounds to produce 40,000 casualties, or about 400 rounds per casualty. Some estimates claim that early in the war, up to 1,000 rounds had to be fired to produce one casualty. By mid-1863, however, target practice was common, and entire regiments spent a few days blazing away at fixed targets with better battlefield results. The Civil War pitted brother against brother and classmate against classmate. This was true of Illinois College. The Bristow brothers and the Van Eaton brothers signed up on opposite sides, and classmates fought each other. Gilbert Green and his brother Ham left IC and joined the Confederate Army. They were taken prisoner early in the war by a company that contained IC soldiers. In 1862-63, the rush of IC students into the Army and general economic woe produced a low point in the college fortunes. President Sturtevant had taught a class for seniors, but the senior class was small and perhaps of poor quality. Discouraged and perhaps wanting to just get away, he accepted the financial assistance of a wealthy Chicago friend to travel to England to sway public opinion there. Sturtevant knew public opinion in England for the Northern cause was weak, and recent battlefield defeats had weakened it further. IC's trustees offered to continue his salary if he went, and he was encouraged by President Lincoln and Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury. With several letters of recommendation in hand, he sailed the North Atlantic. He spoke on behalf of the Union cause in churches and elsewhere, but he faced chilly audiences and probably accomplished relatively little. Before returning in 1863, before the fall semester, he lectured on a number of occasions about his trip and one lecture was published and then reprinted in England. President Sturtevant's indifferent success in England notwithstanding, Illinois College served the country well. Charles Rammelkamp noted that Illinois College provided the Union with 7 brigadier generals, 12 colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, 8 majors, and 19 captains. Furthermore, he observed that Illinois College, which was only 32 years old when the war broke out, sent at least 240 men into the Army. Much older colleges and larger colleges sent fewer. Princeton sent 150. Rutgers sent 70. Bowdoin sent 267. Amherst 262. These figures are all the more remarkable because many IC students came from families with Southern origins, and they lived in communities where Southern sentiment was strong. In 1864, President Lincoln called for the raising of men for 100 days of service. The purpose was to relieve experienced units from guard duty and other non-combat tasks so they could go and fight. President Rufus Crampton recruited a company of IC students, including the entire senior class. They formed Company C of the 145th Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment. After serving the 100 days in Missouri and in Alton, Professor Crampton, now a lieutenant colonel, and many others re-enlisted as veteran volunteers. 10 Illinois college students died during the Civil War. These 10 deaths reveal 3 remarkable facts, and I don't have answers for any of these facts. First, out of a total of at least 252 who served on both sides, 12 serving with the Confederate armies, only 10 died. If IC students had suffered deaths proportionate to the deaths suffered by both armies, that is to say about 22%, instead of losing only 10 men, Illinois College would have lost about 55. Another fact makes this low casualty figure remarkable. Relatively many Illinois College students became officers, and in the American Armed Forces, officers traditionally have higher casualty rates than enlisted men. Losses by IC students are remarkable in yet another way. Evidently, every single loss occurred either in battle or from wounds suffered in battle. Not one died from disease or accidents, the causes that killed most soldiers in the Civil War. In virtually all wars before the 20th century, disease and accidents killed far more soldiers than enemy fire, and this was true of our Civil War. There's a third remarkable feature about Illinois College students, the dead. Evidently, the Illinois College students. Evidently, not one deserted. We do not have the complete records of every student who served, but there is no indication of desertion, not even during the terrible months of 1864, when Union desertion rates were at their highest. I can only speculate about the relatively light losses suffered by IC men, the fact that all losses were battle-related, and the amazing fact that not even one deserted. But I hope some IC student here tonight will research these unusual facts about Illinois College students in the Civil War. For some students and others, the war was a lethal experience, and for others it was an ordeal that left them wounded, sick, or in other ways hurt. The war coarsened some and led them to do things they would not ordinarily do, including shooting at people, destroying property, playing cards, drinking, and other things that many considered sinful. But for many others, the war was a liberating experience. I guesstimate that about half the soldiers that I've studied had never traveled out of their home state. The war pulled many of them from their isolated locales and took them into a broadening world, one filled with new sights and new experiences. The war gave them their first ride on a train or a steamboat, the first crossing of a major river on a bridge, or their first trip through a railroad tunnel, or their first ride on a canal boat or on ocean-going ships. Some Illinois soldiers in Louisiana joined soldiers from Massachusetts in grilling alligators. Strange flora and fauna of the deep south awed many, as did the reddish soils of the upland regions and the rich alluvial soil of the Mississippi Delta. Some noticed that the sun was much higher at noon than at home, and they wondered why. Soldiers from the Appalachians marveled at the first true sunset they had ever seen. Before the war took them out of the Appalachians, they had only seen the sun sink behind the nearest ridge, which is entirely different from seeing a true sunset on the horizon. The war brought soldiers face to face with slavery and with blacks and with whites who were not much different from Illinoisans. And they heard Cajun accents, Gullah and Spanish and French spoken. Others lamented fierce secessionist sentiment in some places right up to the end of the war. And others rejoiced at discovering pockets of loyalty in the South, even early in the war. Weapons and explosives awed many soldiers, heavy artillery, and the ironclads being especially impressive to them. Mountains of ammunition and other supplies at supply depots impressed them, as did huge, clean military hospitals. The marvels of high-tech transportation helped keep soldiers in touch with home to a remarkable degree. In northern armies in the East, telegraphs operated right down to the brigade level. Moreover, soldiers were amazed when packages of food from home arrived intact 2 days after being mailed, and they read fresh hometown newspapers. Hundreds of millions of letters sped back and forth, and soldiers' letters reveal touching concern for loved ones back home. One concern may seem highly unusual today, but it appeared frequently: worry that loved ones might freeze to death. People in the 1800s froze to death, especially the elderly, the handicapped, and the poor. These letters helped people keep in touch during very trying times, and this helped to create social cohesion and promote national unity. The war heightened nationalism in soldiers. Regiments from Illinois and other western states were often brigaded with regiments from Vermont, New Jersey, the new state of West Virginia, or regiments from elsewhere. Illinoisans got to know men in the regiment next to them, and they realized that they weren't so bad after all. Views softened. Many soldiers, for example, came to respect German immigrant soldiers, often referred to as the Dutch, and soldiers from Ireland and Italy and elsewhere. After the war ended, soldiers from Illinois joined soldiers from many other states to participate in the huge Grand Review, a splendid 2-day victory parade in Washington, D.C. on May 23rd, 24th, 1865. While in Washington for the Grand Review, soldiers gazed at the Capitol building, the Smithsonian building, and the partly finished Washington Monument. Some stood silently in front of Ford's Theater. Washington was not huge, but it was the largest city many of them had ever seen. Before the war, many Americans thought of themselves as citizens of their states or as inhabitants of a region of the country. But the war transformed many of them into Americans. In a somewhat similar fashion, some soldiers found a home in their regiments. Soldiers returning to their regiments after a leave or furlough sometimes wrote back to their siblings or parents to say that they had, quote, returned home. They had come to regard their comrades as their true brothers, and they would stay with them to the end. This bonding created the invisible glue that builds unit cohesion, morale, and fighting effectiveness. It also strengthened nationalism. This was especially true for families from dysfunctional families or from other depressing situations, which often involved a falling out with someone back home. Some soldiers wrote back to their families at the end of the war to inform them that they would be coming home only for a short time, only to help with the harvest and then gather things before leaving. Still others wrote home to say they were not coming home at all after the war. They were going out west, or they were going to stay in the east, or they were going to stay in the south, a section of the country some of them had come to love. Many soldiers who developed strong ties with their units often re-enlisted in early 1864 as veteran volunteers. Veteran volunteers formed a crucial part of the Union Army by May 1864. They numbered around 200,000, and their skills, experience, and dedication did much to win the war. Without the veteran volunteers, the war might have been lost. Inducements for re-enlisting included sizable bounties at the national, state, and local levels, as well as private bounties, as well as offers of promotion and a 1-month furlough. Many IC students became veteran volunteers. Veteran volunteers enlisted in early 1864, and thousands of them paid for that decision with their lives in the terrible bloodbaths of that May and June and July. When news of the fall of Richmond, Virginia reached Jacksonville on April 3rd, 1865, the city erupted in a celebration. The end of the war was in sight. After the war, one regiment returned to an appreciative Jacksonville. As it stepped off the train, it was led to the town square by some of Jacksonville's leading residents. And upon entering the square, they were seated at benches next to tables with food and drink. Then all of the other soldiers around the square were invited to be seated. Then any veterans from the Mexican War or the Indian Wars were invited to be seated. And then the townsfolk sat themselves. After a few obligatory remarks from dignitaries, choirs sang, bands played, and a fine meal was had by all. Celebrations of this kind continued in many communities well into the summer. Don Doyle, in his fascinating book on early Jacksonville, notes a huge day-long celebration on July 4th, 1865, out at Camp Duncan, a celebration carefully designed to heal the bitter feelings among local people. Such gatherings were common throughout the North and even in some places in the South. Unlike other parts of the country, Morgan County prospered during the war and suffered no post-war slump. Despite the absence of young men in the workforce during the war, Jacksonville grew from about 5,500 in 1860 to almost 6,500 in 1865, and by 1870 the town was home to 9,200 residents. Cultural life also flourished, mostly through voluntary associations. In 1862, Julian M. Sturdivant and others associated with Illinois College, in September 1861, Julian M. Sturdivant and others associated with Illinois College founded The Club, a literary society dedicated to discussing the war and issues associated with it. And other people associated with the college in 1864 helped found the Literary Union for similar purposes. Current members of both of these societies are in the audience today. During the war, women formed associations to bake for the soldiers and to sew clothes. The Christian Commission and the Loyal Ladies League actively sought ways to help the community, especially families whose men were away in the war. The Jacksonville Philharmonic Society provided much appreciated music to soldiers and others, and the energetic Professor Sanders gave patriotic speeches. Wood was collected in the fall and winter for needy families. And Don Doyle notes that the ancient and sharp distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor faded during the war. The new Portuguese community raised a company of soldiers. Residents made every effort to encourage men to volunteer so the draft would not operate in the town, and they succeeded, something they noted with pride for years. New construction underway before the war ended graced all sections of town. Perhaps sensing a desire to bind the nation's wounds and reunite, one former Confederate soldier re-enrolled at Illinois College. In 1866, the trustees of Illinois College directed the faculty to compile a list of Illinois College men who served in the war. Evidently, the faculty did not do this. But in 1867, the men of Sigma Pi published honor rolls of men who had served. And in 1890, Phi Alpha did the same. It is from these roles and from additional corrections made by Charles Rammelkamp and others that we have the names and the related information of the approximately 240 who served the Union and the 12 who served the Confederacy. Much more information, however, is now available online. Veterans brought back military terms and slang. These terms included graybacks, a term referring to both lice and to Confederate soldiers. The term hoss referred to a man who was strong and courageous, a real man. The term open the ball meant to begin a battle. The term tea kettle referred to ironclad warships, which got extremely hot during the summer months. And soldiers who served in the Eastern armies used the term Virginia Quickstep. The soldiers who served in the Western armies used the term Tennessee Quickstep, and both referred to soldiers who had bad cases of diarrhea. Many soldiers used such military jargon for the rest of their lives, and some resented it when civilians used these terms. During the war, soldiers formed deep attachments with their regiments and to their corps. And after the war, regimental ties remained strong. Regimental reunions lasted well into the 20th century, strengthening these ties. Membership in the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, also strengthened these ties. The Grand Army of the Republic was founded over here in Decatur in 1866 by Benjamin F. Stevenson, and it grew to be the country's largest organization of Union veterans. Local chapters of the GAR throughout the country were called posts, and these were usually named after Civil War battles, heroes, generals and colonels, and leading politicians. Every state in the North and West had GAR posts, and Illinois had hundreds, including posts in such nearby towns as Pittsfield, Barry, Winchester, Griggsville, Meredosia, Chandlerville, Waverly, Carrollton, Virginia, and Jacksonville. Jacksonville had two, the Matt Starr Post and the Governor Yates Post. At meetings, GAR members read papers dealing with the war to each other, and they had these papers had patriotic themes. Posts sponsored or took part in parades, picnics, and civic meetings. The GAR lobbied for pensions for veterans and their families. They maintained homes for old soldiers who needed care and arranged for funerals for members. It helped establish Decoration Day, now called Memorial Day, to honor slain soldiers. At its peak in 1890, the GAR had over 400,000 members, and posts were scattered all over the North and West and in places in the South where Union soldiers settled after the war. The GAR nationally and locally supported Republican candidates for office. Another organization cropped up after the war, one that still has ties with some students here at Illinois College and perhaps others at Illinois College. General Ambrose Burnside, the man who claimed that his soldiers couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, decided to do something about that lamentable fact after the war. He noted that European soldiers no longer fired their rifles in inefficient volleys and had instead become good marksmen. General Burnside joined with William Conant Church, a veteran and the editor of Army and Navy Journal, and with George Wood Wingate, and in 1873 formed the National Rifle Association, Burnside becoming its first president. Challenged in 1874 by a British rifle team for a long-range shooting match, I think it was 1,000 yards, the NRA responded by forming a rifle team and practicing, and later in 1874 they won the match. This generated public support for military marksmanship training and propelled the NRA into national prominence. I sincerely and ardently hope this talk this evening will motivate some IC students to go to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield and to go online to research Illinois College students and Illinois College in the Civil War and shed more light on these students and on the college. I thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. And if it's not too hot and not too late, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. A number of the handouts are being passed out now. If you're here with a couple of other people, if you could just take one and for that group, that'd be great. We simply don't have enough for everyone. Who has any questions or comments? Yes.
Who did you say was the group who purchased and distributed the 500 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin?
That was, I'm blanking on the name, and I should know it, but it was a, yes, I did. A patriotic organization that sprang up during the war, at the outset of the war, or pardon me, before the war, to get abolitionist views across. I'll try to find it in the next minute or so. Well, I struck out with one. Are there any other questions? Yes. One.
In the library, in the main entranceway, on first and second floor, are photos and information regarding Civil War Blue Boys
Yes.
that are from Illinois.
Yes.
And it tells a little bit about
It's a wonderful exhibit. Yes, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. I hope everyone can get over there to see it. And I might add too, we have in our midst one of our very finest Civil War researchers, Mark Johnson over here, and he knows a great deal about sources in the library and the exhibit, and his specialty is, among other things, monuments, Civil War monuments, and other commemorations of the war. Are there any other questions that people might have or comments? Yes.
the exhibit's free.
Yes, it is. Yes, very good. Thank you for that, too. Have all the handouts gone out in all directions? I hope so. There are still, I see some going around. Yes, sir.
Dr. Davis, what was it, do you think, that compelled young men, knowing that they were going to die the subsequent day on a battlefield, and who the night before would write letters home talking about loving their families and that they would see them in heaven? What compelled young men to, knowing that they were going to die, go to the army to fight?
Yeah. A very good question that I don't think has any firm or, let's say, certain answer, but I've read enough of those letters written by men who are certain that they're going to die in the next battle, the next day, and many do. I'm convinced of several things. One is that these men, in some cases that I know of, these men had terrible disappointments at home. They had felt betrayed at home, one way or another way. And their attachments to their units meant everything in their lives. And by getting killed the next day, so to speak, they would be with, in their minds, their comrades who had been killed earlier in the war. It was a way of, it was a brotherhood of the dead, so to speak. And some wrote about that. Some wrote about, I will see Bill and I will see Harry and George in a few days. And when you study who these people are, these are his comrades who have been killed that were in the person's mess or otherwise close to them. In other instances, or at least one other instance that I'm aware of, a person in effect committed suicide by enemy fire. He wanted to be killed, he was killed, and the reason was to spite people back home. There was a long-standing feud that ended badly, and it was his way, I think, of saying, you will have this on your conscience for what you've done to me. In other instances, there's just an immense loyalty to others in the unit. When casualty rates were high, as they were in the Confederate forces, and I've done almost no work in the Confederate forces, but when casualty rates are high in a given unit and replacements come in, and people look at this guy over here and this guy over here, and they don't know anything about them, and they're new, they just hope that these people won't do anything to mess up your life or the life of your remaining comrades. There's no closeness there, at least in the letters that I've read. And once the unit, in a sense, disappears out from under people, and the few remaining veterans, especially veteran volunteers, by the summer of 64, say at Atlanta or Kennesaw Mountain, the few remaining veteran volunteers, I think, try to maintain the honor of the unit, the integrity of the unit by fighting on, but they have little to do with the new people in the unit, so to speak. They're not part of it yet, and perhaps never will be. You know. But those are two takes, and then I think to be frank, as I mentioned, some of these people drooled over the bounties. Some of these people could get the equivalent in today's money of, Mark, help me here, maybe the equivalent of $20,000 in today's money? Yeah, a lot of money, yes, to re-enlist. And then there was the promise of promotion, especially if you indicated your willingness to command a black unit. If you became an officer in a black unit, you could leave the Army perhaps a captain, maybe even a major, toward the end with brevet promotions, and you would gain. You would go home as an officer, and that meant something back home if you wanted to run for office, if you wanted to do anything. So the element of gain was there. There's no doubt about it. Patriotism, I doubt if early in the war more than 10% of the Union soldiers fought to free the slaves. After Union soldiers got down into the South and saw slavery and met slaves or former slaves, free blacks, that began to change. And in the letters, you can see this transformation of these guys who sometimes, when they first encounter blacks in the South, are very harsh in what they write home. I mean, they're very harsh. A year goes by, 2 years go by, and what happens is that some of these people they do 180, a change in their views. And the war becomes something different in their minds from what it had been at the outset. For many, many young men, and this sounds crass or an oversimplification, the war was going to be a summer's lark. It was going to be over quickly. It was going to be a grand opportunity for the boys to go out and get away from home and do something and come back. When that was no longer the case, other motivations had to keep people going. But I suspect above all, it was the loyalty to their particular messmates, their closest comrades, to the regiment that kept so many of them going to the end. Yes?
The thing that really surprised me was you said that they had good contact via telegraph. I was always under the impression that sometimes the men were gone and the family didn't hear from them for 2 years at a time as to whether they were dead or alive.
Well, in some cases, those who wanted to hide themselves in the Army, so to speak, could do just that. I've read letters written by frantic parents to captains or to the colonels of regiments saying, my son is in your regiment, I've not heard from him for 3 months. Why not? You know. And finally, the colonel grabs the guy by the scruff and puts him down and makes him write a letter. But some people did want to, in a sense, hide in the Army. In other instances, I think there was simply desire not to write home on the part of some of these people. But I'm amazed at the speed of communications of letters and of packages. Cakes arrive that can be freshly eaten. Other food arrives that has been cooked, and the soldiers open up and pass out baked goods, cooked goods, whatever. And it's amazing. Sometimes in 2 days, packages go from central Illinois to units in Tennessee, to the men in Tennessee. It's really remarkable. Yes?
I have a comment and a question. First, I was raised by a mother who was raised in the South, and she always called it the war more than a thing.
Yes, yeah. Or Yankee aggression.
Yes.
Yeah.
My question is, you said that most members of the Army died of disease or accident.
Yes.
How many actually, what percentage died actually in battle?
Out of the approximately 620,000 who died, I think about, I used to know the figures well, 35% perhaps died of battle-related causes. That includes those killed on the battlefield and those who die sometimes months later of their wounds. It's well under 50. It's well under 40%. I used to know the figure much better than I do now. Yes.
I have heard it said that more died from the surgeon's knife than died on the battlefield.
There's truth to that, because the idea of germs was not understood at the time. Dr. Bone here in town gave a paper, which I think some of you have heard, about that very topic, and it is true. Surgeons would sometimes operate on one person, be covered with blood from the operation, wipe their knives on their aprons, and go and operate on the next person. And all they were doing was moving the germs from patient to patient and killing them. They didn't know that at the time, of course. During the war, I think by '63, if I'm not mistaken, surgeons began to notice something, and that was that after a big battle, when wounded would come in in great numbers, they couldn't tend to them all, and they would tend to those that they could, but others would have to lie out in the fields nearby or under trees in great agony, waiting to be treated. And maggots would crawl over these people and form, and it was ghastly to look at. And people wrote these letters home saying, "Oh, the maggots are nauseating," and so forth. But what the maggots were doing was cleansing the wounds, and the surgeons began to realize those people out there who are covered with maggots are doing pretty well, and so they began to re-examine things. I think Jacob Lister did not come out with his understanding of germs until about 1867 or something like that, and Koch in Germany a bit later. And so the germ theory was not well known, but people knew, did have some understanding about the need for fresh water, fresh air, and the like in treating people. And when I've read and I've seen drawings of these hospitals, and I've read accounts of these hospitals, Union hospitals in Kentucky and elsewhere, they were marvelous. They were incredible feats of construction, and for the day they were state-of-the-art medicine. But again, they did not understand germs. Yeah. Are there any other comments? Yes, one more. Yeah.
I got to quit, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
The total number of deaths, including the North and the South, was 1,000,000, almost 300,000.
I've never seen that figure.
At the museum,
Huh.
including the North.
I hope not. Casualties. Yeah, casualties. Yeah. That is 1,300,000, did you say? Yeah.
700,000 100,000.
Yeah, that may be, if you include sickness in that, people who got terribly sick because of service in the military, you might reach that figure. If I'm not mistaken, the uppermost figure that I've seen of wounded approaches 400,000. So it'd be over 620,000 dead, maybe 50,000 civilians dying prematurely because of the war, and then maybe 400,000 plus wounded during the war. And the wounds, well, anyway, the wounds are hard to measure, hard to keep track of in terms of numbers. There's a big variation in those numbers. People, are there any other questions that you might have? You've been very patient. It's been a wonderful audience. And is there any last question? Again, I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm greatly honored by your presence. Thank you so much for being here.